From safe and dumb to smart and vulnerable, who's on the legal hook for damage and injury? What will fail first, your oven or the software running it? What about your garage door? What about your home security system? Do smart devices need to be updated? Can they even be updated? Why is it important? These devices may fail in many ways that were not anticipated by the manufacturers, and there's a widespread risk of injury from connected devices. Or is there? What can you do to prevent problems, and what legal recourse is there if you suffer injury or property damage? Want to learn more about the Internet of Things? I'm attorney Stephen Tepler, chair of the cybersecurity practice at the law firm of Mandelbaum Salzburg. My guest today is Craig Ziegler, a cybersecurity and Internet of Things expert from the Silent Group in Sarasota, Florida, who will be discussing the ins and outs of smart, connected devices, what we call the Internet of Things.
Malicious software. The robots are coming.
They say we are not prepared.
Spying, snooping.
It's scary.
So we're so fortunate to have as today's guest Craig Ziegler, who's an expert on IoT devices at the Silent Group in Sarasota, Florida. Craig, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Hi, Stephen. Most of what I do is investigating cybersecurity incidents for a broad range of clients. Do a fair amount of research in not only IoT devices, but general malware and exploit vectors. Also do quite a bit of penetration testing and general security auditing, providing strategic guidance and thought leadership in various threats and how they evolve and impact to businesses.
Wow, and I guess that means that people get impacted by this as well, don't they?
All the time.
So here's the problem, Craig. We've all heard about and read about smart, and we all have basically in our homes, in our offices, and wearing them, smart or connected devices and the Internet of Things. So I'm going to lean on you, and you can tell me and tell our audience, what exactly is the Internet of Things?
Okay, so Internet of Things for most people are all of the various connected devices. Everything from those speakers, I don't want to mention any company names, but smart watches, things like your Fitbit, your Garmin watch, your Apple Watch, to your washer and dryer and your garage door opener, and any of the home security cameras. Some of those are connected directly to the internet, some of those connected to other devices that you'd place in your home. Most of them are wireless even. So they'll connect to your home wireless and then reach out to various places on the internet.
Let's talk about more. What about connected skateboards? Are those IoT devices?
Only if they connect to, again, if they connect to a network or connect to the internet. In some cases, these devices are relaying via something like Bluetooth through your phone.
What about cars?
Cars are often connected all the time. An example of this being Chrysler, who several years ago had some issues with some of their infotainment systems being accessible. A lot of their more upper-end cars or more well-equipped cars have a cellular modem built into them. Not only can those be used by people in the car for internet access, but the infotainment system can stream satellite radio, can stream things like Pandora or other devices, but you can also use that cell modem to control your vehicle from your phone. Anything from lock and unlock to set off the alarm to even a remote start.
So in the case of Chrysler, and I guess it's FCA, right? Fiat Chrysler, there was reports of, and actually a lawsuit pending, about the ability of these cars, the infotainment system in these cars, to be hacked. Isn't that what you're talking about?
Yes. There was an incident where the infotainment system provided a link for an attacker to compromise the automated steering and braking system. I believe it was on the Jeep Cherokee.
What does that mean in real terms, in everyday driving experience? What does that mean? What kind of risks are presented by that type of vulnerability exploit if it turns out that this vulnerability exploit is what the researchers say it is?
Potentially, the threat vector is that they could apply the brakes. They could use the adaptive cruise control to speed up the car, or potentially in the case of, and I'm going to switch off of Chrysler, but Tesla at one point was found that they could actually drive the car using a compromise through the infotainment system.
So this raises, from a legal perspective, an interesting set of problems for manufacturers and retailers. In the case of a car manufacturer, you have a potential hack which might be very dangerous and possibly cause property damage. The car might be damaged if it gets into an accident, or even endanger people's lives, right? Because if you can control a car remotely, that means you can make a car do what the driver doesn't want it to do, and perhaps get into an accident or worse.
You could definitely do anything from move the vehicle, and this might be a little far-fetched, but you could potentially find a way to start stealing cars. If you can remotely start a vehicle and get it to drive itself, there's no reason you couldn't have it steer its way out of a parking garage.
And it's not impossible for that to happen, I would presume, from what you're telling me. Now, from a legal perspective, you have a product liability possibility, and you've all heard of the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act. There is a possibility for a negligence lawsuit. Negligence meaning that a manufacturer knew or should have known of the security problems and vulnerability exploits. There's a possibility for misrepresentation. If these vehicles are represented as being safe to drive, and when in fact they're not, that's also a possibility that manufacturers and retailers are facing. But it's not just about cars, is it, Craig?
No. One of the more commonplace and maybe less directly impactful vectors are things like smart speakers that can easily be listening to the conversations within your home, or recording personal data about you and then shipping it off to a third party.
Wow. When we come back, we'll find out more about these legal issues arising from problems with the Internet of Things, security vulnerabilities, and coding defects from silent Internet of Things expert Craig Ziegler. Welcome back to the Cyber Law Now podcast. I'm attorney Stephen Tepler, and I am so pleased to have Craig Ziegler from the Silent Group here talking about problems that arise from the Internet of Things. We're talking about cars. We're talking about not only cars, but speakers that have issues that permit privacy invasions. Is that correct, Craig?
Definitely. I believe there was a case not too long ago that a criminal case was brought up using evidence provided by one of these smart home speakers that happened to be listening to a conversation.
Now, when this sort of thing happens, depending upon what state or what jurisdiction you're in, you may have a privacy rights lawsuit against the manufacturers. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that, and again, speaking from the perspective of an attorney who brings both lawsuits for the plaintiffs and defense in these, that on the plaintiff side, there are many many agreements that you have to agree to either online or in order to use these devices, which require you to go to arbitration. And arbitration has been the great mitigating factor for manufacturers, preventing them from being sued on a class action or a representative basis, so that one, and by class action I mean that one representative sues the company on behalf of all of the affected customers or consumers out there who've been affected or have had problems or privacy invasions or been subject to issues relating to defects from IoT or Internet of Things devices. And there's a huge fight going on now on the consumer side, saying that arbitration provisions basically are they rob people of the ability to go to court. You have to go to a private arbitration. There's no jury. The arbitrator pretty much can do whatever the arbitrator decides to do. And the issues, if the arbitrator makes a mistake at law, for the most part, it's not even appealable. But with that, we're looking at more than just speakers and watches. What about infrastructure? What about cities are becoming smart. They're gridded out. They have sensors that control a lot of the functions that city governments provide to their citizens. What about those?
A lot of these devices are generally centrally managed, but you're correct. They have various sensors and various control mechanisms that are distributed throughout a service provider's geographic environment. An example being some of the power meters, the smart power meters that are read remotely. Those devices could potentially become compromised, or in some other cases could be used for something like a botnet. That would be where these devices that are connected to the internet can be hijacked and used for other unintended purposes. For example, to attack another organization. One example of this would be a recent Chinese manufactured home router. It's an inexpensive unit. The Chinese company makes some of the internal components for these devices that were found vulnerable to remote attack. These devices were commandeered and then used to target other companies. That infrastructure was actually put for sale on the dark web.
Wow. And a lot of these devices are not even configurable to make them more secure. Isn't that correct?
In a lot of cases, in the case of that firewall, they're not really configurable. It's to perform their function, they have to be allowed to have internet access. There are some other devices. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
There are some other devices that provide mitigating circumstances, but it's not something that the general layperson would be able to do or would feel comfortable doing. One example would be a smart garage door opener. So these devices reach out to a specific website and an account that will link to your smartphone so you can open and close your garage door remotely. That device doesn't necessarily need to have internet access completely. It could be locked down so that the only thing it can communicate with is the manufacturer's web portal. That narrows the threat vector, and if this device is compromised, at least it can't be used to target a third party. You still have vulnerability of the manufacturer's web portal. Conceivably, somebody could gain access into that and open and close garage doors anywhere they wanted to.
So you bring up a good point that I have used in some of my law school classes that I teach, and that is when you use a smart device or many smart devices, and we'll come back to the to infrastructure in a little bit, you're actually, for the most part, you don't control your garage door with your phone. You're telling a manufacturer's website to send a signal to your garage door to open or close.
Correct.
And so the vulnerability is there are at least 3 vulnerabilities that can take place, I think, in my mind, and I'll talk about the legal issues of them in a minute. And that is the website can be compromised, the manufacturer's website that is used by these phones to access and open up doors and close these garage doors can be compromised. The phone can be compromised, and without notification to the manufacturer, there's no way that the manufacturer will know that it's not you, especially if you have pre-programmed your password into that phone where it doesn't have to use where you don't have to enter your password all the time. Or the device outside, the wireless device outside your garage door has a very simple password. 1, 2, 3, 4, for instance, ABCD. So from a legal perspective, there are 2 ways of looking at this. From the plaintiff side, from the consumer side, you can say, the web manufacturer had poor security, poor vulnerability, had a high degree of vulnerability, exploit potential, and this is what happened, and all of a sudden all of the garage doors in a very, very wealthy area seemed to open up on a Saturday night when everybody was going out partying, and then they got robbed. From the manufacturer's perspective or the defense perspective, you would also be able to say, 1, 2, 3, 4 is not a good password on your wireless device that's outside your garage door, so you, the consumer, have some blame to bear on this. And by the way, if you pre-program your password into your phone and you lose your phone, that's not our problem. You have to presume that somebody else will have full access, and therefore you don't have that kind of you can't sue us because you share in that negligence, or you're equally negligent, or even more so, and so we're not liable. When we return, we'll find out more about the dangers lurking inside these connected devices and talk about botnets a little bit more with silent security expert Craig Ziegler. Welcome back to Cyber Law Now. I'm attorney Stephen Tepler, chair of the Cybersecurity and Privacy Group at Mandelbaum Salzberg, a law firm, and I am so pleased to have with me as my guest Craig Ziegler, an Internet of Things cybersecurity expert with the Silent Group in Sarasota, Florida, who's been giving us the lowdown on the problems with the devices. So, Craig, we've been talking about botnets, and a botnet to me is a contraction of a robot on the Internet. Is that correct?
Yes, or I guess one of the more common terms for it is a zombie device. The device actually doesn't know that it's being manipulated, and it's just sitting there by itself doing exactly what it's told, which may or may not be what it was designed for from the manufacturer.
And the consumer may have no clue, and probably doesn't in most cases. Isn't that correct?
They normally have no idea that their device has been compromised unless it's doing something strange. They would never know the difference.
Wow. And so we're going to turn the tables right now, and I know that Craig had a question for me.
Yeah, Stephen, we were discussing things like the garage door opener and possible liabilities. Most of these garage door openers are put in by an installer. Let's face it, most people don't install their own garage door openers these days. So the question would be, when that garage door installer puts that device up and helps that homeowner configure that device, do they have any exposure for not setting a decent password on that device, or simply just leaving it default?
You raise a very good question here, and the issue is whether or not the installer, from a negligence perspective, would have a duty to inform his consumer, his customer, that he should change the default password that's usually something like admin or some word that's very, very common, and use something more robust. When I had my garage door installed, my installer actually said to me, you want to change that password and make it and personalize it so that very few people can guess it. And that's exactly what we did. But you're right, there can be liability all through the retail chain from the manufacturer down to the installer, depending upon the type of the device. If it's a device that is inherently dangerous, there can be a strict liability issue. When you think of strict liability, you can think of a gas tank that's manufactured defectively, and because a gas tank can be considered to be inherently defective because it can blow up because of what it contains, strict liability is a very, very from a liability standpoint, all you have to prove, the hurdle to prove liability and strict liability once you get past certain procedural issues is much easier rather. But it depends on the device, and you have devices like hot water heaters. You have devices that are there are smart lawnmowers, for crying out loud. There are smart farm devices. There are smart industrial devices. And if these fail, think about refineries. Think about all other sorts of possible areas where you basically can embed some code and off you go. And if the code isn't designed in a way to be both not defective and secure, and these are two different issues, these are two different areas which can give rise to legal liability. So this whole area of Internet of Things is evolving. Liability issues are evolving. And today, what we've learned about the Internet of Things is that these things can cause problems. From kitchen appliances to home security devices to infrastructure. Think power and utility companies. It's been reported that the Russians are trying to attack our utility companies and compromise your utility companies. Think about turning on and off your water, your sewers, your power. These things can also cause injury or property damage if they're defective in some way that causes them to operate in a way that causes damage. Manufacturers and retailers can be sued for negligence, product liability, or misrepresentation. But you, the consumer, can also take steps to minimize your risks. Be smarter. Be smarter than your things. Check out the reviews. Use very, very strong passwords. And update your devices where possible. And by the way, do not, if you can, don't buy devices that can't be upgraded. And you'll be able to find out by reading up on that. I want to thank Craig Ziegler from the Silent Group for joining us today. Craig, I appreciate your taking the time out of your busy day, and thank you, our listeners, for your interest in the podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe and get all of your podcasts while you sleep. Share with your friends, like us on Facebook. If you have a cyber law subject you want to hear more about, give us a shout. Join me and Silent Cyber Guys, Craig Ziegler and Jake Simpson, for a live from DEF CON set of podcasts where we'll talk about the latest hacks, attacks, and the law. Until next time, this is Attorney Stephen Tepler on the Cyber Law Now podcast. Thanks for listening.